Dr. Yoder received his BA in history from Franklin and Marshall College in 1942 and his PhD in American Church History from the University of Chicago in 1947. He taught at Union Theological Seminary, New York City, at Muhlenberg College, and at Franklin and Marshall College before joining the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania as assistant professor of religious thought in 1956. He taught within the newly formed graduate department in folklore in the 1960s and soon expanded the discipline to include the study of folklife, based on his knowledge of European scholarship in folklife and regional ethnology. He was chairman of the Department of Folklore and Folklife at the University of Pennsylvania from 1966 to 1969 and co-chair from 1969 to 1971. He has continued his distinguished career teaching and researching American ethnic and regional cultures, lecturing on American immigration history, genealogy, particularly Quaker, German, and Swiss families in Pennsylvania, folk religion, religious folk music, folk medicine, folk costume, folk cookery, foodways, folk arts, and material culture as an active scholar since his retirement from the university in 1996. Dr. Yoder was co-founder and a director of the Pennsylvania Folklife Society beginning in 1949. He served as co-editor of Pennsylvania Dutchman from 1949 to 1958 and of Pennsylvania Folklife from 1958 to 1962 when he became editor, serving until 1978. He was elected a Fellow of the American Folklore Society in 1972 and elected President of the American Folklore Society from 1981 to 1982. Dr. Yoder testified before Congress in favor of the establishment of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. From 1976 to 78, he served on the first Board of Trustees of the American Folklife Center. And at the American Folklife Center, we are very fortunate to hold the valuable field recordings made by Dr. Yoder of Pennsylvania Spirituals. The Don Yoder collection of wire recordings has recently been digitized, and while listening to this wonderful collection on my computer, which is, they're really accessible now, these recordings, I felt recently as if I had had a transcendent experience through time when I heard Dr. Yoder interviewing Sophia Baylor, a practitioner of Pennsylvania German healing tradition powwowing. At the time he made the recording in 1952, she was 82 years old. And she is describing on the tape learning about powwowing when she was a young woman, so in the previous century and now 2 centuries ago, in the end of the 19th century. It was just a kind of a chilling, wonderful moment. These are a great resource for us, Dr. Yoder's field recordings. And in talking with him recently, I recently learned that his next project is a book on powwowing, and when it comes out, we can add powwowing to the Library of Congress subject headings. I'm a cataloger, so I think of these things. As one of his students, I can attest to the extraordinary gift Dr. Yoder has for teaching. He received the Lindback Award for Distinguished Teaching at the University of Pennsylvania in 1986. He has directed 53 dissertations in 4 academic disciplines: folklore and folklife, religious studies, American history, and American civilization. And best of all, generations of his students, including myself, benefited from the unforgettable field trips he has led through the Pennsylvania countryside to Amish farms, Mennonite churches, historic graveyards, and farm museums. Dr. Yoder's publications, numbering in the hundreds, include Pennsylvania Spirituals in 1961, American Folklife in 1976, Discovering American Folklife, Studies in Ethnic, Religious, and Regional Culture, 1989, which was reprinted in 2001. One of my very favorites, his book Groundhog Day, published in 2003. His masterful study, The Pennsylvania German Broadside, A History and Guide, was published in 2005. On behalf of my co-chair, Leonard Primiano, who, as many of you might know, he started this lecture series and named it in honor of Dr. Yoder's work in religious folk life. So this is the Don Yoder lecture, and we have Dr. Yoder tonight. It's wonderful. On behalf of Leonard, who unfortunately isn't with us tonight, but is in spirit, we welcome Dr. Yoder and congratulate you.
Thank you very much, Maggie, for that beautiful introduction. I want to comment upon, thank both Leonard Norman Primiano and Margaret Cruzy for inviting me to give this lecture. And I'm just glad they didn't call it the Don Yoder Memorial Lecture. I'm going to talk about broadsides today. There are two words that are used for broadsides. One is my favorite, that is broadsides itself, which is the older term. The other is broadsheets, which somehow is preferred by some scholars in the British Isles, in Scandinavia, and in Germany. But we also can consider many broadsides ephemera, and according to the definition of ephemera by Maurice Rickards in his Bible of Ephemera, it's called the Encyclopedia of Ephemera, published in 2000, ephemera are minor transient documents of everyday life, even though he admitted that some items are neither minor nor transient. I am going to, in this lecture, as in my book, The Pennsylvania German Broadside, A History and Guide, my intention was and is to use the broadsides produced by the Pennsylvania German culture to illustrate and help us to understand that culture that has been under development on American soil for over 300 years. In using the Pennsylvania German materials, I hope to illustrate what is expressed in the title of my paper. I have two titles. One is Using Ephemera to Interpret a Culture, and the title which you have in your program is Folk Religion and the Pennsylvania German Broadside. And this reminds me of the professor who, when he was asked to give a lecture, they said, submit some titles for us so we can pick one. And he submitted 8 titles, and he said, but they're the same lecture. So let's plunge in. The book relates the broadside first to the individual's place in the culture through the baptismal certificate and related personal documents of identity through the rites of passage. Second, to American political and military history. Third, to the various levels of medicine, including that curious art known as powwowing. Fourth, to religion. Fifth, to the economic life through sale bills and auction advertisements and other areas of everyday life. Through the broadside, we catch vital glimpses of the Pennsylvania Dutchman and his Hausfrau and Kinder at church, at country sales or vendus, as we call them, at militia musterings, at community picnics and other neighborhood gatherings where the entertainment involved the songs, the ballads, the stories, and the jokes, the latter often on the raunchy side. We include over 2 centuries of broadside production. The dialect and present-day English language broadsides announce church suppers, Dutch plays and religious services, tall tale contests, or liars contests as we call them, community picnics, homecomings, and other gatherings that bind the Dutch people together, often through the use of their special language, Pennsylvania Dutch or Pennsylvanisch. Through the broadsides, we can also begin to understand the folk spirituality of the Pennsylvania Germans, which includes much more than their official religion or churchliness. Here we have, for instance, the archaic New Year's wish, chanted in German to bless each farm and household in the community on New Year's Eve before the shots rang out as the new year was literally shot in. And the chanter and the shooters were invited into the farmhouse kitchen for drinks and refreshments. After that had happened 8 or 10 times during the night, they staggered home to their own farmhouses, but woke up and to eat a noon meal of sauerkraut and pork, which is de rigueur in the Dutch country. And I never celebrate New Year's without having sauerkraut and pork. There is also the deeply spiritual Haussegen, or house blessing, a prayer for protection of house and farmstead, family, servants, and even the animals in the barn. And finally, there is the equally spiritual but more occult Himmelsbrief, the heaven letter, written allegedly by Jesus himself in golden letters and let down to the world. One of its attractions, apart from the protections it promised, was the fact that it represented extra-biblical revelation, since it was written after the last word of the scriptures had been written down and canonized. With this brief introduction, let us look at the 3 languages of the Pennsylvania German broadside. When we survey the broadside, among the Pennsylvania Germans, we find that they illustrate the fact that in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Pennsylvania Dutch people were trilingual, using three languages: High German, or better called Pennsylvania High German, English, and Pennsylvania Dutch, or Pennsylvanisch. To give you a practical example, I'm the 9th generation in my Yoder family in Pennsylvania. My immigrant ancestor, Hans Yoder, born 1672 in Canton Bern, Switzerland, a Swiss farmer who moved to Germany for 10 years, left Schwetzingen near Heidelberg in Germany in 1709. And in that year, on March 1st, 1709, the Reformed minister of the parish of Schwetzingen wrote that this family left for the island of Pennsylvania. The minister was highly educated in theology at the University of Heidelberg, but they must not have taught geography at the time. Hans Yoder spent the winter in London with thousands of other Palatines who were driven from their land, and he came to Pennsylvania, to the Pennsylvania Promised Land in 1710. In my own family, the High German language came down in all of its uses to my grandparents, born in the 1840s, both of whom attended the German parochial school of the St. Jacob's Union Lutheran and Reformed Church, to which their families belonged, in the tradition-rich Macantongo Valley in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. While they used Pennsylvania Dutch at home constantly and with their neighbors, and could use English when necessary, with strong Dutch or Dutchified accents, of course, they could read, write, and speak High German. For example, when the minister, the Pfarrer, as we called the pastor, visited our farm, my grandparents spoke Hochdeutsch, as we called High German, to him. But my aunts, their daughters, born in the 1870s, told me that grandfather and grandmother Yoder did not use the present German polite form Sie, which did not exist in Pennsylvania High German. Instead, they used the archaic older form ihr, the plural you, as in the French vous and the Italian voi. As my aunts put it, sie haben Pfarrer geirrt, they said ear to the pastor. But High German came down one more generation in my family to my father and his older brothers and sisters, all of whom who had listened to German sermons and sung German hymns in the Union Lutheran and Reformed Church that our family belonged to. At our church, which had the beautiful name of Frieden's Church, the Church of Peace, in the Lycans Valley in Schuylkill County, the High German services lasted until 1912. But in many country churches in Berks and Lehigh counties, the last High German services were phased out in favor of English in 1948. So the world wars had nothing to do with destroying the German language, at least in the churches in Pennsylvania. Now to another subject. How were broadsides produced? Actually, they were the combined product of the skills of several individuals. First, the schoolmaster or minister who wrote the lugubrious poetry for the ballads or Trauerlieder. Second, the country or town printer whose press produced the printed sheet. And thirdly, the woodcut carver. In some cases, this was the printer himself who provided the illustrations and overall design. In the case of the Taufschein, or baptismal certificate, there was a fourth participant, the Fraktur artist or scrivener, who filled in the data about the individual whose birth and baptism were here memorialized, and usually added artistic flourishes of decoration, angels, birds, fantastic floral designs, and geometric patterns, which today we might call hex signs. The second question is, how were broadsides marketed? How did they get to the people? They were peddled, of course, at markets and fairs by entrepreneurs who had them printed in the towns and tramped out through the countryside with them. As I said in my book, if I may quote myself, the peddlers were, quote, the Johnny Appleseeds of the print world, sowing the Pennsylvania Dutch culture with new thoughts, excitements, and songs, which they often sang to their customers by the firesides in the farmhouses where they stayed overnight. In Europe, print sellers tramped the roads from village to village, offering their wares. There was, for example, in the 18th century, a Bavarian broadside and picture peddler who tramped through Austria selling goods to the distress of the Catholic priest at the village of Harthausen. The priest, as guardian of morals for his flock, described him as, quote, commonly called Briefsteffel. We even get the name of the peddler here, literally Broadside Steve, who in that region went around peddling his wares. In general, such vagabond, pamphlet, and picture hawkers are always a danger in the villages, even when they are Catholic, since through their greediness for sales, all kinds of superstitious blessings, prayers, disgraceful songs, and other things endangering faith and morals are spread about among the simple and credulous farmer folk, the like of which I collected a whole basketful from my parishioners and burned. This was Catholic censorship at the parish level. An equally amusing American example of an ephemera peddler is described in the book Travels Through the United States of America, 1799, by the Duc de la Rochefoucauld-Liancourt. The Duke reports hearing on his travels of, quote, an impostor doctor, a German from Frankfurt, operating in the country between Lancaster, Reading, and Northumberland. That's exactly where my family was living at the time, particularly the least inhabited parts of those counties, with a collection of small phials, deceiving the people into a belief that he is a physician. He vends medicines, bleeds, draws teeth, or sells ballads to such as do not choose to buy his drugs. This accommodating peddler took his horse along with him laden with his goods, and his faithful dog trotted along behind. He stayed overnight with the farmers, who were glad to entertain him on account of his knowledge and abilities. He makes a good song, they said, and appears on the whole to be a sly, crafty fellow who began his career as a player, an actor. That would damn him right away with some of them, I'm sure. To conclude my brief introduction, I wish to say this. In the preface to my book, I made an important suggestion, which I will share with you this evening. The year 1830 as a cutoff date for research on the Pennsylvania German broadside is no longer tenable. The date derives from Professor Steidensticker's pioneer book, published 1893, on the German language printing, books, pamphlets, almanacs, newspapers, and broadsides produced in Pennsylvania and the neighboring Germanic settlements in other states from 1728 to 1830. 20th century bibliographers have unfortunately continued to use that now canonized date. What I said in the book is as follows. Where do we go from here? In collecting broadsides, it is my urgent suggestion that the period from 1830 to the present be inventoried. I have personally found that post-1830 German broadsides of the Pennsylvania Dutch and the English ones that began to appear alongside them are just as interesting as the colonial and pre-1830 19th century examples. And then there is the entire 20th century. To show the range of material produced by the Pennsylvania Dutch culture in the 20th century, now mostly but not entirely in English, I have included in this volume rare broadside posters announcing community picnics, church suppers, cakewalks, band concerts, spelling bees, and other gatherings where the people came together to enjoy the day with their neighbors and friends. My serious suggestion is that all these more recent examples of local printing should be collected now. The country printers themselves should all be contacted for examples of their job printing work. In 1876, the Library Company of Philadelphia, which sponsored my book, had the good sense to send collectors into every building, every exhibit at the U.S. Centennial in Philadelphia. They filled bushel baskets, again bushel baskets, with ephemera, all now dutifully preserved and available for research at the Library Company. Our libraries should send bushel basket collectors out over the entire Dutch country today to gather up the fragments that remain. In case you don't know that last phrase, it's a biblical phrase, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Anyway, that's the end of my introduction. Now if we can have the lights and the first slide. That's the second slide, Jerry. That's the, yes, right, the cover of my book, The Pennsylvania German Broadside, A History and Guide. And it uses as its logo some details from the Gustavus Peters Taufschein baptismal certificate of about the 1830s. We'll look at that again in the darker period. Oh, I don't need this light, I guess. Oh, sorry. In honor of the institution that made this revolution in communication possible, the printing press from the 1450s, I have this marvelous picture from a book printed by Benjamin Franklin, no less, and his associate Johann Böhm, who was imported from Germany a year or two before that by another printer from whom Franklin more or less stole him. He was an engraver, and he did the engravings for what is probably the most important Pennsylvania German devotional work of the 18th century, Arndt's Wahres Christentum, the true Christianity of Johann Arndt, the proto-pietist mystic from the eastern part of Germany. And this is interesting because it is a printing press as Johann Böhm conceived it, as they used in Franklin's office. And at the bottom is the inscription, Ungedrückt, ungeschickt. Where there is no pressure, there is no skill, or no skill develops, as I translate it. This is a peddler. This is the logo of the Trento Conference on Prints, the European conference that I attended last March, flying over the Alps in a prop plane, watching the snow in the Alps and looking at the frozen lakes below and so forth. This is an Italian peddler of picture prints. They went all over Europe from this area in the Tyrol. They tramped over Europe with their portfolios of prints, and they became very famous for this. This is another peddler. I put this in. He's not a print peddler, but I have a whole series of these very interesting satirical prints of, they look like peasant dwarfs. He is a peddler. He's carrying a rack of material and so forth, and there's a humorous inscription down at the bottom. This plate is interesting because it's a satire on the Bänkelsänger, as the singers of songs at the markets, in the market squares of Germany and the other parts of the adjoining countries were called. They stood on benches so that they could be seen and heard. And this is called Ein schönes verlobtes Paar Marktsänger. It's a kind of dialectized German. A beautiful and betrothed pair of market singers. Note that they are not married, and this, of course, they were traveling around without benefit of matrimony. They were only betrothed, and this is satirical, of course, too. They also were fringe people, marginal people. As you can see, the man is a cripple, and his clothing is torn. The wife is wearing the regulation public apron, but it's torn also. But they're both singing lustily, and he's pointing to an obscene picture about which the song is written. I think that's a marvelous print. It's from the public library at Bamberg in Germany. This is a passion song about the Passion of Christ and Geistlich Lied, published in Lancaster by Francis Bailey, a very early printer who used German. He could speak German and use German perfectly. And at the bottom it says, published by Francis Bailey, Lancaster, for Singfrau, for the song woman or for the singing woman. Who was this song woman? Was she a cripple? Was she a blind person? She sang on the streets of Lancaster. She went to Francis Bailey's print shop to buy these songs. And this, I think, shows us that the connection of the European spread of broadsides and songs, ballads, and so forth continued in America in the 18th century. This is about 1780. Religion and the broadside is very important. This is a picture of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, the organizer, the great intelligent organizer of the Lutheran congregations and synods in colonial Pennsylvania and other states, preaching in a barn. I think the print is by a European artist because he had a very good knowledge of German regional peasant costume, but I'm sure the immigrants would wear some of their peasant costumes until they were worn out here in Pennsylvania. This is a picture from a famous book, the Harbach's Harfe, the first book of poetry published in Pennsylvania German. It shows a congregation, the minister in the high pulpit. The men are separated from the women, and a man has come in late, and he's praying into the hat. This was in die Hutbede. This was a custom that was brought from Germany. When you came in late to church, before you sat down in the pew, you lifted your hat to your face and said a silent prayer. This is a portrait of Dr. Demme, who was the pastor of the Lutheran churches in Philadelphia in the 1820s. He succeeded Justus Christian Heinrich Helmuth, who came over in 1769 and died in 1825, a very famous Lutheran minister. He's dressed in the regulation ministerial gown with the white bands under his chin. It's a very beautiful engraving, and it reminds me of, to mention Martin Scharfe's very excellent book. Martin Scharfe teaches Volkskunde or Europäische Ethnologie at the University of Marburg, and he wrote a book called Evangelische Andachtsbilder, Protestant pictures of devotion. And he has a chapter on pictures of the ministry, who were often role models for the people in the congregation. I think this is a good role model picture. This is a broadside which was pasted into a book. It's a book plate. Johann Georg Benzel nimmt dieses Buch mit auf die Reise nach Pennsylvanien. This is in 1726. He went to a printer and had a special book plate made for this very valuable book. And he dates this at Worms in Rheinhessen, now in the Palatinate, in 1726. This is a Taufschein done by Heinrich Otto, who developed the idea of printing a model Taufschein which could be filled in by a scrivener, the data, and so forth, the names of the people, the dates, and then he filled in the borders with freehand birds and fantastic flowers. This is typical folk art because it's not representational art. These are not real-looking birds, reality-based birds and flowers, but they are abstract drawings as in folk art. This is the bottom line of Heinrich Otto's Taufschein, showing a curious angel or cherub and some many-pointed star-like flowers, very beautiful, and the colors are typical of the work of the late 18th century. In the 19th century, many presses began to print printed Taufscheins, baptismal certificates, and this is one from Reutlingen in Germany, and it has a kind of philosophy of history. If you look at the bottom, there are the crumbled idols of antiquity, and it moves up through the Old Testament, through the New Testament, and the large green panel up at the top is the Lord's Supper, but above that there's something even more important, and that is the American eagle, suggesting the transit of glory, the transit of civilization from the ancient world through Palestine to Europe to America. This is a confirmation certificate. These were printed too. These were not as popular as the Taufschein or birth and baptismal certificate, but there were a great many of them, and I included some very interesting examples in my book. Confirmation in the Protestant churches was around the age of 13, 14, 15. It could be later. It might be a little bit earlier, but usually it was around 12, 13, and so forth. This is a confirmation class at Dunkel's Church, a Union Church in Berks County, Pennsylvania, not too far from Kutztown and Reading. The pastor was to the right. His name was Pastor Shirey, and his wife posed to the left. The girls all have their new dresses, which they were given as a gift on this holy day of confirmation when they joined the church as full members of the church with the full rites of communion. And the boys had new suits. I like this picture very much, and this was one of the customs in Pennsylvania. When you were confirmed, you got a confirmation certificate. You had to study with the minister or the schoolmaster, study the catechism for weeks before this great day on Easter or Pentecost when you were brought into the church by the rite of confirmation. And then you had your picture taken very often in the latter part of the 19th century. This is a wedding certificate in English, very Victorian with handsome Victorian flowers, and there's the boat of matrimony going there with an angel steering it in front and the young couple standing up in the back. I hope that the boat didn't come into any kind of wreckage during the marriage. This is an elegy. The Pennsylvania Germans exalted death and the funeral. We still don't have a good book on death and the funeral among the Pennsylvania Germans. It would make a terrific book. It reminds me of the book describing death and funeral customs in Upper Bavaria from an exhibit that was had at the Stadtmuseum in Munich some years ago. They published a book called Die letzte Reise, The Last Journey, and it's full of popular and folk art done in Upper Bavaria, Oberbayern, for death and the funeral. This is for Esther Hermann. She was the wife of a very prominent Reformed minister, Carl G. Hermann of Kutztown, who had about 12 churches at one time to serve in circuit, and he had 2 sons who became Reformed ministers, and so forth. This was not written by the husband, the grieving husband, but was written by his Lutheran colleague who served many of the same Union churches, Dr. Yoder. This is a European elegy. It's not a broadside, but it's a Leichtpredigt, a funeral sermon. This was a custom in 17th century Germany and 18th century when a nobleman died, especially, or a minister, someone in the higher classes of society. They published a whole pamphlet of tributes and the sermons at the funeral and the tributes in Latin and German verse. And this is for a man named Hans Ludwig von Nauendorf. It's from Altenburg in Germany, 1720. This is a Pennsylvania memorial piece for a girl named Louisa Spang, or Spang, S-P-A-N-G, who was a member of the ironmaster's family of Spang, who founded Spangsville near Kutztown in Berks County, Pennsylvania. It's a very beautiful Victorian piece with the neoclassical urn and tomb and the grieving mother, who's rather stout, it looks like, and a brother and sister. This is a picture from an almanac, a German almanac published in Pennsylvania in 1837 called Der Sterbende Christ, the Dying Christian. And there is the Christian who has just died in the bed with his grieving family, kneeling and standing around. And his little soul is being conducted by 2 angels upwards, and an angel is coming down with a crown to give this righteous Christian a soul. A very interesting picture showing the idea of the afterlife that most Pennsylvanians had in the early part of the 19th century. Religious art has many aspects in Pennsylvania in the Broadside. This is a rather crude crucifixion print, but rather interesting, done by 2 printers named Blumer, B-L-U-M-E-R, in Allentown about 1830. They were sons of Abraham Blumer, who came from County Glarus in Switzerland in the 1770s and became minister of the Reformed churches of Allentown and some of the country churches around about. He had a close connection with some of my families, which makes me very much interested in him. He had been a Feldprediger for the Swiss troops in their foreign service for many years before he came to Pennsylvania, and he learned French so well that he was invited actually to become the pastor of the French Reformed Church in New York, but which he refused. He refused the offer and stayed among his beloved Pennsylvanians. This is a print by Gustavus Peters of Harrisburg, who was an immigrant from Saxony about 1820. He went to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and linked up with a printer named Moser, and Moser and Peters did this print of the unjust court, das ungerechte Gericht, or unjust judgment. And there is the high priest under his canopy, the little Jesus in red to the left, and Pilate sitting in majesty to the right. There are Roman soldiers out through the window, and the cartoons above the men sitting there, this is the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, they are giving their opinion on whether this troublemaker, this troubler of Israel, Jesus of Nazareth, should be executed or let free. This is a German version, or rather an Alsatian version from the press at Wissembourg, the Wenzel press at Wissembourg or Weissenburg in Alsace, of the same scene. It's reversed with Jesus to the right and Pilate to the left. This is a rather important scene. It comes from Matthew, the broad way and the narrow way. The narrow way that leadeth unto life, the people are going up, it's very steep. At the top is the New Jerusalem, and Christ is welcoming the saints who are coming up the steep hill at the gate. And the ones who are on the level here are dressed in the highest fashion of the 1800s. There's some military men there and some wealthy women and men, and they're all heading to you-know-where. There's a rather crude devil pictured there with a tail and horns and so forth, and he's going to get them. There are several people who started out on the narrow way, but they go on the green path, and they end in hell also. The broad way that leadeth unto destruction. That's from Matthew. This was secularized in the 20th century. This is hard to see, perhaps, from the audience, but instead of heaven, you have success, and instead of hell, you have failure. Rather an interesting economics thing. This is a Haussegen. This is printed in Augsburg, but it was copied in Pennsylvania, and it has 12 hearts around the central heart, and they all have devotional verses, which are like prayers. But the house blessing was very important. As I said in my introduction, it blessed everything about the household, the children, the father, the mother in their work and so forth, and the servants, even the animals in the barn. And these were precious documents to the farmer class people in Pennsylvania. They sometimes framed them and put them up on the walls. They never framed their Taufscheins, despite the fact that Winterthur Museum has a Taufschein room with framed Taufscheins. These were personal documents, and you kept them for yourself. You folded them up and put them in your Bible, or you rolled them up and put them in your bureau drawer. You saved them. You read them occasionally throughout life and remembered the minister who baptized you or the schoolmaster who made the very beautiful print. But this is a Haussegen, a house blessing, which is a different thing. This is another house blessing. This is from Catholic Switzerland, from Zug, the city of Zug, but it has the 12 hearts with the 12-hour devotion, and it has vignettes around each corner of birth to death, the symbolism of life proceeding from birth to death. This is the Haussegen published at Ephrata in Pennsylvania. Very simple, but a very beautiful verse, a kind of prayer for the household. And there's some religious symbols on this. The grape leaves at the bottom of the heart, which symbolize the Passion of Christ, and the springing deer, the tribe of Naphtali in the Old Testament, and the rest are decorations. There's a big argument about Fraktur in Pennsylvania, whether the designs which the artists put on the pieces had religious significance, or whether they were simply decoration. We're still divided on that question. The heart is very interesting. The Pennsylvania Dutch heart is evidently flat like that. It's not the high heart that you have, the high vertical heart that you have pictured in French Canadian folk art, for instance. But this is the Pennsylvania Dutch flat heart, and if you want to know how to draw it, you draw a square and divide it into 4 parts and make the 4 hearts like this, and you have the flat heart. You can try it when you get home. This is a Catholic house blessing, and this enables me to say that there is a difference between Catholic and Protestant broadsides very often. The Protestants liked holy words because of their rooting in the Bible, their being rooted in the Bible, and the hymn book and the prayer book. They are a people of the Word, and their broadsides and house blessings and Fraktur stressed words, stressed text. The Catholics liked pictorial evidence of God's action in the human theater. And this is a typical Catholic folk art, or it's between folk and popular art, a print from Europe showing three popular protective saints. On the left is Saint Roche, or Rochus in German, pointing to the sore on his leg. And he healed you from the plague, symbolic. And there's a dog behind him. He's always associated with Saint Roche. He licked the sore, and so forth. In the middle is Saint Sebastian with the arrows. He was popular because he was one of the few saints that you could picture without clothing in the period when that was not a very, very good thing to do. The one to the right is my favorite. He's Saint Florian, and he's the patron saint of Upper Austria, Oberösterreich, and the city of Linz, which is its capital. And he protected from fire. He's showing pouring water on a burning building. Among the Austrian peasants, there's a wonderful rhyme that goes like this: O heiliger Sankt Florian, schutz unserem Haus, sind andere an. O holy Saint Florian, protect our house. Set fire to others, but protect our house. And this shows us that in Catholic folk religion, sometimes there was the idea developed that the saint who could remove danger could also bring danger if you didn't treat him right. I think that's generally said in German folk cultural books. This print is interesting because it has two levels, like most Catholic folk art and popular art. The saints are standing on the earth. They are men, of course, and up above is the heavenly world of help available for Catholics, with the Trinity in the center, the dove below, and Christ the Son in the middle, and a very papal-looking God, the Father, up above. And they're surrounded by angels, suggesting the heavenly world and the earthly world together. This is a typical European Protestant Haussegen, published at Basel around 1700. A very elaborate one with many, many prayers. This is a Himmelsbrief, a heaven letter or letter from heaven, supposedly, as I said, allegedly written by Jesus and sent down to the world. This is a very early Pennsylvania one, very beautifully designed. It's horizontal rather than vertical. There was a whole shift in printing in Pennsylvania in the early 19th century, where originally documents that were horizontal were turned and became vertical. There must be some good reason for that in the technical side of printing, but I haven't gone into it. But I put this slide in to show you that you must never repair documents with Scotch tape. This is the earliest known Himmelsbrief in captivity. It's from the Bavarian National Museum. It was printed in Munich in around 1500. And it's the St. Michael's Himmelsbrief. There were about 12 different versions of the Himmelsbrief, even in Pennsylvania, and this is the one which was said to have been sent down to the holy mountain of St. Michael. And this could be Mont Saint-Michel on the coast of Brittany or Normandy, or it could be St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall across the Channel. There were monasteries in both of these places where things like this could have been written. This is a very interesting document. We published at Kutztown, Pennsylvania, near Reading, and we call it the Firebrief, the fire letter, because it purports to protect everything from fire. But it's very similar to the other Himmelsbrief because it protects you from other things too. Down at the bottom, perhaps you can see the letters CMB, and those are the three holy kings, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. And they were the saints to whom the great cathedral at Cologne was dedicated in the Middle Ages. And in Catholic Europe today, very often in Germany, for instance, in the Catholic provinces or Catholic households, they go around on Three Kings Day, January 6th, Epiphany, and mark now KMB, because they spell Casper with a K today instead of a C, KMB above every door to protect the house and bless it. This is interesting because in the very fascinating travel book by Goethe, the Italienische Reise, his Italian journey. He describes a trip by boat from Padua down the Brenta to Venice. And in the back of the boat, that isn't a nautical term, but I don't know what I should say, there were two men sitting. They were Germans, obviously. They were pilgrims. They were dressed in the regulation pilgrim outfit. And Goethe saw that the steersman, who was back there too, wanted to talk to them, so he moved back and was the interpreter. When they got to Venice, the two men took out their leather briefcases and took little documents out of them. There were Latin prayers to Caspar, Melchior, and Balthasar. And at the bottom of this piece, there is a Latin prayer to Caspar, Melchior, and Balthasar. I think that's rather interesting, showing a European use of this very important document. And this is a favorite of mine. This is the Italian Himmelsbrief, the L'unica vera lettera di Gesù Cristo, the one true letter of Jesus Christ, and with the crucifix and so forth. It's very similar to the German Himmelsbrief because it says you're not supposed to work on Sunday, you're supposed to go to church, you're not supposed to deny the truth of this document. If you do, you'll be damned, and you're supposed to spread the document to other people, or you'll be damned. So I'm spreading it to all of you tonight. And at the bottom, there's a very interesting thing here. At the top, there were three saints, the three most important female saints, women saints in the Middle Ages, I think, were Saint Brigitte of Sweden, who had all those visions of Christmas glory, and Saint Matilda and Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, now Elizabeth of Marburg. And there's a prayer that they put together there, and that is printed in Pennsylvania in German. Anyway, at the bottom, it says that this document was blessed, Benedetto, by His Holiness Leo XIII in 1889. I doubt that very much, but because this is folk religion and not official Catholic religion. But it's interesting that the idea of the letter from heaven, the extra biblical revelation and so forth, is found in most Western European countries. There are Scandinavian versions, there are English versions, and so forth. This is the Italian version. Adam and Eve were very popular, also because you could picture them without clothing. And this is a famous broadside, of which there are at least 24 different versions by different printers, called Adam und Eva im Paradies, Adam and Eve in Paradise. And one of my friends, Walter Boyer, with whom I did a book of Pennsylvania Dutch folk songs, found that the text of this, which is really a dialogue between God, Adam and Eve, and the snake, is based on the Paradise mystery plays that were given in the churches or out in the churchyards in the Middle Ages. This is rather interesting, and let's take a closer view of the two ancient parents and the snake. An artist has painted the tree of life or knowledge, I guess it was, with red apples, and they look like apples, even though there were no apples really in the Bible. And I found among the prints, I must go back to the library where I saw that particular print, an artist painted little Masonic aprons on Adam and Eve, which I think is the final touch of glory for this print. This is Rinaldo Rinaldini. This is not a broadside, it's from an almanac, and this was a European hero, a kind of sleazy hero, I guess. His story was popular in Pennsylvania, and the almanacs and some of the broadsides contain some of these European thrillers. This is also not a broadside. It's from a little book called Das Herzbüchlein, the little book of the heart. It was written by a Catholic priest who was converted to Lutheranism in Germany, and he wrote this for parents and grandparents to instruct their children on the things that might be in their heart. This is the human heart with the 7 deadly sins in the heart, and the face above doesn't look very happy. This is what happens when grace comes into the heart and the deadly sins flee, but still the person doesn't look very happy. Another genre among the broadsides of Germanic Pennsylvania are the carriers' addresses. And these were done, printed for the newspaper boys in the towns who went around to their clients 52 times a year. They were weekly newspapers, delivering papers. And on New Year's Day, they took a broadside like this to their clients and knocked on the door, and they were admitted. They gave the broadside, and they were refreshed with refreshments and sometimes given a tip. And the poetry was sometimes humorous, sometimes political, and usually if it's kind of on the folky side, the boys put at the very end a very gripping plea for a nice tip, because they've gone through all sorts of weather through the year to deliver their papers. This is a rather famous one from 1873, from what used to be called the Reading Adler. It should be the Redinger Adler with ER, but they cut off the ER in most cases. The paper is the oldest in Berks County from the 1790s. It's still going, but now as the Reading Eagle. That's the old Reading courthouse of the colonial period in Penn Square, which was torn down in 1841. This is a broadside which was framed, made for framing. It's a picture of a Mennonite farm, which is an ancestral farm of my mother's, the Stauffer farm, called Cedar Spring Farm in Fermanagh Township, a nice Irish name, Juniata County, Pennsylvania. My people bought that farm in 1812, built all the buildings, and the trees on the hill behind are cedar trees. There's a two-story spring house and a very interesting scene. The little house and barn to the left are for the servants. Across the ridge from that farm is the Gingrich farm, and this was also ancestral. I only tell close friends that my mother's mother was named Gingrich because they did not like Newt Gingrich or any of his ideas. But this is where my Gingrichs were born, and I was actually named for a Gingrich, although he spelled his name Gingery, as we did in central Pennsylvania. CH was very hard to pronounce, and so we changed it to Gingery, Gingery, and Don Gingery, D-O-N Gingery, was my mother's first cousin, who was our red-hot Democratic congressman during the Roosevelt era, and I was named for him. Write that in your diaries, please. This is the Pennsylvania Dutch broadside, a very important one. I think it's unique. It's now in the library company in my collection. Die Groß Pennsylvanisch-Deutsch Picnic am Donnerstag, den 9. August 1934. And this was near Punxsutawney, the great groundhog town, in 1934. The whole thing is in very good Pennsylvania Dutch. That was a Pennsylvania Dutch settlement in Jefferson and adjoining counties, and at that time they were still using Pennsylvania Dutch. This is one in English, but it suggests that there is a Pennsylvania German worship service with Pater Ressler down at the bottom. This is the St. Michael's Union Church. It's still Union. It was built in the 1870s for about 800 people. At that time, it was, or 1,200 people. It was the largest country church in Berks County. This is a favorite broadside of mine. It's a poster, turkey and waffle supper, family style, 2003 at Bellarmine's Church in the Fellowship Hall. But before that, there was a Pennsylvania German service, everything in our Pennsylvanish language, in the old Bellarmine's Church. I was there for both, and I would vote that both got A's, in my opinion. I sat at the table with the preacher who preached in Dutch, and we enjoyed the turkey and waffle supper after the service. I collect these things. I think these things should be collected. And again, I suggest that we go to the country printers to get copies of these things when they print them. This is a record cover in Pennsylvania Dutch. This is Percy Einsick, dressed in great Pennsylvania Dutch style like a cowboy. I mean, it shows the influence of the popular culture on the Pennsylvania Dutch in the 20th century. And he's singing two songs, Die Ford Machine. This came around about 1905 or 10 when the first Model Ts came chugging through the Dutch country, and Schnitzelbank. And his Schnitzelbank version is very good because he has a yodeling accompaniment, which is somewhat unusual for Pennsylvania. I have some copies of this. I could give some of you copies if you would let me know that you want them. This is a Taufschein, just a few more pictures. This shows the influence of the outside culture on the Taufschein producers. This was done by another immigrant from Saxony, Karl Egelmann, in Reading, and it shows the neoclassical pillars, the neoclassical urns with fire coming from them, and Jesus is being baptized in the River Jordan up at the top with the Holy Spirit coming down like a jet. And down below is a rather stiff-looking Jesus preaching to the disciples who are kneeling around him. Egelmann did this engraving himself. He was very important. He had a lot of very interesting contributions that he made to Pennsylvania German culture. This is what happened to the Taufschein in the 1880s and 90s. The angels put on weight, and they no longer are dressed in folk dresses. They're dressed in Victorian silks, and the birds are no longer abstract birds. They're birds of paradise and so forth. But again, it shows you the influence of the outside world on the Pennsylvania Dutch world of print. Again, this is a diversion. This is one of the dozens of wonderful Portuguese religious prints that I picked up one time on a visit to the great flea market in Lisbon. I bought a whole stack of them. This is the Mother of God in Latin down below with her divine child. And in Mexico City, in front of the great church of La Purísima, one time I saw this display of broadsides decorated in the colors of the Mexican flag, prints, the crucifixion, the holy hand with the saints on top, and this whole rack, a whole table of wonderful little chapbooks. And they were called oraciones, prayers in Spanish, or novenas, 9-day devotions, and I picked up most of them. I bought at least several of each variety for show and tell in my folk religion classes. And this was the dear person who was in charge of them. She was glad to see me that day because I bought so many of them. This is a terrible slide. I made it many years ago at Franklin and Marshall College. It should have a background. It's Jesus Christ the Fountain, Christus Fons, the symbol in religious art. He's standing between two mountains, and blood is spurting from the 5 holy wounds. We don't know whether this was printed in the United States, in Pennsylvania, or in Europe, but it could be Moravian, because the Moravians had a cult of the 5 wounds of Christ. But of course, this was a common idea in evangelicalism in Britain. They had the hymn, which some of you may recognize, there is a fountain filled with blood, drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunged beneath that flood lose all their guilty stains. That was written in, I think, by John Newton in the middle of the 18th century. So this is Christ the Fountain as a symbol. This was a pietist symbol, but it was also used in the Counter-Reformation in Catholic Europe too. There was a great interchange of symbolism in art in the 17th century when the Catholics were revising some of their ideas and the Protestants were doing the same thing. And Moravianism in Pennsylvania was a bridge movement between Catholicism and Protestantism, especially in art. This is the church that I mentioned, Frieden's Church, the Church of Peace. It's still standing, it's 2 stories, and I like it because my father was baptized there, and my grandfather was a member of the building committee. He gave the bricks for that church. All the bricks were made on our farm, and it had a high tower. Unfortunately, it was struck by lightning some years ago, and they couldn't build it up to this beautiful height. They have a kind of stumpy tower now, but the church is still there, and it's very important to me. This is a picture of an aunt of mine driving her husband's car. She couldn't drive, or she wasn't allowed to drive at the time, maybe. And my Aunt Luella, my father's youngest sister, and the other women in the car are also sisters of my father. This is the first car that came to the valley where we lived, and this is in front of our farmhouse. This is a better picture. There's my grandmother Yoder in the black dress, my Aunt Emma sitting down on the porch to the left, and she was a terrific influence on me in explaining the culture that we came from, the Pennsylvania Dutch culture. She had an almost photographic memory for the camp meeting or bush meeting songs that she heard when she was a teenage girl. They went by wagon and slept in the wagon and had the religious services and sang these wonderful Dutch choruses or spirituals that I did a 500-page book on. And they have modal tunes, interesting tunes that are different from the sweet Sunday school tunes that many of us know. The other women are my other sisters of my father. But I like this very much, and I put it in, that's his other broadsides, the Himmelsbrief, and so forth. It shows that there was a connection between the ethnic cultures in the Pennsylvania Dutch country and coal region. This is an evangelical print. Again, it's like the two ways print. You have to choose between Jesus and Satan, heaven and hell. This is a Victorian print showing the heavenly railway. Jesus was the conductor. You had to be careful to get your ticket so that you could get to heaven. There was a song in German called Der Geistliche Regelweg. In Pennsylvania Dutch, we didn't have the word Eisenbahn. The people came over to America before there were any Eisenbahn in Germany, and they called it a Regelweg after the English word railway. And there goes the train. The conductor is conducting the tickets, and here is someone who missed the train. Poor fellow, he'll never get there. Again, this is the beautiful logo. We can look at it a little bit better here. This is the Gustavus Peters, Carlisle, and Harrisburg. It's really Harrisburg print of the 1830s showing the angels. He did the woodcuts himself. He was born in Saxony in the 1790s and came over in 1820. And these angels are interesting because it's 1830 and they're still wearing empire costume, which was a little out of date at the time. And up above, Peters made sure to put the American eagle, suggesting that this was a religious piece, but we were here in blessed America. This is his successor, Theo Scheffer, who printed all sorts of job printing. Again, gather all of this while it's available. He had The Heart of Man available. He had the Powwow book, The Long Lost Friend, and so forth. This is a rather interesting book ad. And this is the last of the pictures. This is a Mennonite memorial from the Old Order Mennonites of Lancaster County. The family name is Wenger. And in the medallions above, where they're really pages of a book, are the materials about Father Wenger and Mother Wenger with the dates of their birth and death. It was printed by a local printer and probably framed in the houses of the children. And at the bottom is the interesting hymn, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. And I used this as a last picture to show the terrific influence that the outside world of Anglo-America and Anglo-American religion had on the Pennsylvania Germans. Because the song, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there, was written by a Methodist preacher in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. It's on the Evangelical Hit Parade even today. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yoder. I'm just a thrill to see your slides. Hear you give this wonderful lecture for us. Joel Pocius is our respondent on this session. Joel Pocius is University Research Professor at Memorial University. He's published widely on material culture and folk life. He's recently been working with various levels of government in Canada on UNESCO's 2003 Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage. He studied with Dr. Yoder some 30 years ago at Penn.
Thank you, Maggie. It's a real honor to be here this evening. The first thing I want to say, though, is a number of months ago, Leonard Permiano contacted me and asked if I would do this honor, and I gladly said yes. And I'm saddened that Leonard is not here tonight, and I'm sure all of our thoughts are with him this evening as he struggles with his health. So he's in my thoughts. It's an honor to do this because I didn't realize it at the time before I came, but Don was honored with the Lifetime Achievement Award, and it gave me a chance really not only to comment a bit on some of his work in ephemera, but I think to say a little bit just in general about the influence of his scholarship on so many of us. His Dr. Kinder, as he refers to us, and some of the I think the characteristics of his scholarship that often are not appreciated. When thinking about the work Don has done on ephemera, I realized that that Don, in fact, was a peddler of sorts. He was a peddler of ideas to his students. He was, to use his phrase, the Johnny Appleseed of grad school. And he wasn't that imposter doctor that roamed around his ancestral county, but in fact, a real influence to a lot of us. He peddled, as he put it last night, the grit of the particular. And I think that grit of the particular often, people did not really appreciate how important that grit was and how influential it was as we thought about what it was that we were doing as folklore scholars and folklife scholars. And so we sat in his classes, and he peddled every week. He peddled dozens of broadsides and ephemera before our eyes as he passed them around. He peddled, I think, hundreds of books that he passed around, or we went into his office and were amazed at the piles and piles and piles. And of course, he peddled what seemed like the millions of slides that we saw over so many of those courses. And that really impacted, I think, on the way we thought about the world and what kinds of sources that we thought we should be looking at. In many ways, ephemera, I think, is often thought of as a minor source of information. It's a source, a very modest source, that often is relegated to categories like antiquarian, because people collect it, and it's thought of as marginal or minimal. And it's unfortunate because in many ways it's this really rich source that we can gain so much insight from. I was trying to figure out, I kept thinking of Don as the postmodern antiquarian, but I never could figure out what that meant. It sounds good, but maybe he is. Because, finally for me, ephemera is obviously, whatever it is, it's a product of a particular place at a particular time. And I think one of the important points, I reread Don's book on the Broadside last week, and one of the things he says at the beginning of the book is that you can understand an entire culture, really in many ways, through the ephemera that it's produced, the kinds of beliefs and concerns and themes and so on. And of course, Don's work, as we know and have just seen, centers on this, for some of us, a distant culture in terms of the past, or a distant culture in terms of the group. But, I was sitting there yesterday thinking, well, what is this powerful source of ephemera as this entree into the beliefs and concerns and themes of a culture? What about just right now? So I bought my bag of tricks here, because I just went around my hotel room, and now this is the ephemera that you're not going to find. Well, 100 years from now, someone, the descendants of us all, will be paying thousands of dollars for this stuff. So here's the think globally, act locally stuff in your room about the towels. You know, and this has got this great line: if you do not wish to participate in this program, please contact the guest request or the hotel operator, and they will clean your room more often. But then it says, many of our guests have expressed interest in joining in our efforts, and we appreciate your participation. What else? Oh, there's some great stuff in our rooms. Of course, the warning that if you are in a non-smoking room, a $250 cleaning fee will be charged for smoking in this room. And I worry about the people who were on the field trip yesterday who bought all that smoked fish. And you know, there's things. Well, this is my own bag about food. You know, this is crispy whole grain Parmesan and roasted garlic flavor rice and corn cakes are a smart selection because they are low in saturated fat and contain 0 trans fat. And this is one of over 100 smart selections made easy from Pepsi Company. And for more information, I never thought the Pepsi Company was involved with smart selections of food. And then you know what? A closer look at what's new at the Hyatt. Well, what's our concerns? Express check-in, breakfast, and of course the new Hyatt Stay Fit gym, the Hyatt Grand Bed, yoga away at Hyatt, and Hyatt Wherever Wi-Fi. You know, health, food, communication, and again, where's that going to be? Who knows? And then my favorite is the promo for Hyatt Pure. This is the new Hyatt places. And let me just read the first few pages, because I thought maybe a folklorist was involved here. Imagine a place where you can retreat from the demands of the day and immerse yourself in the environment. A place inspired by local cultures and natural elements. And all these wonderful photos. Where authenticity is a part of every experience. A chance to discover natural ingredients, exquisite treatments, and unexpected beauty, and where each escape is designed to inspire your own sense of calm and balance, pure and simple. And then it goes on to describe these various places where you can get all this wonderful experience of life. Well, there's our ephemera today, and I just sat there and said, well, here is us. Here is us through this ephemera. You know, health and the environment and authenticity and natural ingredients. There it is. So, you know, it's all around us, and I think it's powerful stuff. Well, you know, I think over the years, Don's work in things like ephemera, often I think I've been underappreciated because in many ways he dealt with trendy ideas, but he never used the trendy jargon and cliches that we would hear from our other teachers. So we took courses on, and we heard about the Pennsylvania German country. And it really was a place where I first started to understand issues about place and landscape and identity. But those weren't words that we would hear very often, but that's what it was about. Don talked about these various religious beliefs and sects and cults and so on. And really he was talking about the fact that cultures are contested. They're not uniform and not homogeneous, but there's a lot of tension in them, things that we, you know, hear and understand today. And popular images that he used to show us, well, those were exercises in the culture of taste and commodification. And then change over time, one of the points he makes in his Broadside book. Well, those were issues of fashion and what was fashionable. And right at the very beginning of Don's Broadside book, you know, he says, what are these things about? His chapters are divided into issues of performances and customs and politics and medicine and economics and religion, rites of passage and aesthetics. You know, it's the world of all of what we do, but in this very low-keyed way. And I think, you know, one of the great things I learned, and we can learn from not only printed ephemera, but much of Don's work is his concern with history and the past. And I think that often, to my sadness, folklorists don't pay enough attention to the past. We don't do history. And it's a shame, because so much we can learn about ourselves from that past and how things were perhaps similar to us and perhaps different. Well, getting back to my initial comments, as this ideas peddler, Don really peddled what I take for granted now, but I realize I really owe a lot to Don for those subtle ideas of those many images of broadsides and chapbooks and religious prints that he brought to all of our attention. It's that importance of these minor things that often are neglected that really I realized, as I look at the stuff in my room, how centrally important this stuff really is. Folklore often generally is considered by many as ephemeral, unfortunately, and I think Don's work has showed us that all levels of what we can label as ephemeral, really how central and how revealing this stuff is, and how important his work really is to all of us. So I thank you, and it's an honor to be here. You can have some of the
Are there any questions for Dr. Yoder? Okay. Yes?
Don, one of the things you have confirmed for me is that it's not just a time, but it's a place. That's all I wanted to say.
So the past, not just a time.
Right. Thank you.
Professor Yoder, I was just curious, when you were showing us some of those woodcuts, you were talking about the actual documents that survived. Have you found any of the actual woodcuts that made those documents?
Yes, occasionally they turn up at dealers and so forth, and I did use one of them in my book, a woodcut. It's in the, I think it's in the Free Library in Philadelphia, and it's for one of these tauchans, baptismal certificates, with a circular medallion in the middle and so forth. And some of the letters the words are carved in and so forth. Yes, they do turn up, but they are rather rare. A better collection, the Europeans have collected them, and at the Gutenberg Museum in Mainz, one of the most important museums on the history of printing, perhaps the most important in the world, they have a collection of these prints. They also have a wonderful book that's available called Das Blockbuch im Mittelalter, the Block Book in the Middle Ages, showing how these primitive books were made. They were really broadsides stitched into a book. It was one of the fads of the 15th century. They eventually died out as real books came to be printed and bound. But there's a magnificent chapter in this book on the Block Book of the in the Middle Ages on how a woodcut was made. It's the most interesting technology description that I have seen for making woodcuts. Any other questions?